someone were to ask you, what's your Mount Rushmore of horror directors, what would you say? A lot of people might say names like John Carpenter, George Romero, Tobe Hooper, you got maybe even Dario Argento. But there's one person that I believe deserves to be on everybody's list. Someone who changed the game in the 70s, haunted your dreams in the 80s, and reinvigorated the genre in the 90s. That man is Wes Craven. Craven kicked off his career in the early 70s with friend and collaborator Sean Cunningham, who later went on to kickstart his own iconic franchise. You've probably never heard of it though. Before either of them were legends though, they got their start on the controversial exploitation film The Last House on the Left. Regardless of its mixed reception, the film was technically a success, having brought in $3 million on a budget of just $90K. Despite attempting to dabble in other genres, the only film Craven was able to get greenlit following Last House was 1977's The Hills Have Eyes, which was another commercial success and cemented Craven as a horror director, with he himself stating, "It soon became clear I wasn't going to do anything unless it was scary." Cunningham, meanwhile, went on to create his own iconic horror franchise, in the self-proclaimed Halloween ripoff Friday the 13th. This, coupled with the likes of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and many others, were the powder keg that ignited the slasher boom of the early 80s. Not long after this, Craven went on to create his own slasher icon, the character he is best known for and the one who would eventually clash with Cunningham's creation decades later. This character was Freddy Krueger, and the film was A Nightmare on Elm Street. Funny how that all worked out, that two pals and filmmakers would go on to independently create two of the biggest horror icons of all time. What are the odds? After the 80s came and went, and slashers were relegated to the dustbin of horror history, the 90s rolled along, and horror was in sort of a weird place. Enter Craven once again, who, along with idea man Kevin Williamson, introduced Scream to an unsuspecting audience. People were desperately seeking something refreshing in a sea of mostly uninspired horror films. We had some standouts in the 90s, such as Candyman and the subject of this video. Don't worry, we're getting there. But for the most part, Scream is credited for breathing new life into the horror genre when it needed it most, and bringing Craven back to the forefront of relevance for the third decade in a row. Craven would continue to find success in the 2000s with several Scream sequels, as well as some one-offs. While it is no small feat to reinvent the horror genre multiple times in one's career, we can safely and respectfully say that his best films were behind him at this point. Craven is most known for the films I've highlighted so far, but these aren't the only films in his catalog worth revisiting. Not by a long shot. Today we're looking at Wes Craven's 1991 cult classic, The People Under the Stairs. The People Under the Stairs is in many ways a retelling of classic fairy tales in a more modern setting. It hits many of the typical beats. A young hero ventures into a dark castle to free a princess from her villainous stepmother. The hero faces off against menacing creatures, undergoes trials and tribulations, and comes out on the other side a changed person. This is essentially the template People Under the Stairs follows. Sandwiched between 1989's Shocker and 1994's Return to Elm Street, New Nightmare, People Under the Stairs tells the story of Fool and his family, who all live together in a lower-income neighborhood. We're introduced to Fool and his sister Ruby via voiceover. Ruby tells Fool his fortune through tarot cards, in a narrative device that mirrors the plot of the movie in a cool bit of foreshadowing that rewards repeat viewings. Ruby speaks of the Fool, not born out of stupidity but of ignorance. The Fool will find himself between two obstacles and will have to walk through the fire and come out a man. Fool is a young boy played by Brandon Quinton Adams, one of the better child actors I've had the pleasure of watching. Fool lives with his sister and mother, who we discover soon into the runtime is very sick. To make matters worse, they're being evicted soon, as they are late on their rent. Things are just not going well for them. After this, we're introduced to Fool's landlords. They go simply by Mommy and Daddy, or the Robesons, a husband and wife who want to get Fool and his family out of their apartment. Fool's family is the last one occupying the building, and they want to demolish the property, presumably to build some other more profitable building, like a Walmart or something, or maybe like a Chipotle. Oh, and the Robesons have a daughter named Alice, who they are very abusive to. We'll come back to her later. Ruby's boyfriend Leroy, played by Ving Rhames, offers Fool a way to earn the money to help pay their rent. Leroy has recently come into some information linking the Robesons to a large sum of money in the form of rare gold coins. Leroy and a partner named Spencer plan to use Fool's youth to disarm the Robesons in order to gain entry to their large, foreboding house. Fool, disguised as a Boy Scout, is turned away. Spencer, dressed as a gas company employee, is allowed to enter. The Robesons' willingness to let Spencer into the house and not Fool is a not-so-subtle example of their racism, one of the themes Craven tackles in the film. After being in the house for a suspicious length of time, Leroy grows paranoid that Spencer plans to cut him and Fool out of the score, and the two of them follow him into the house. After being attacked by Prince, the Robesons' guard dog, Fool and Leroy split up. Leroy goes upstairs and Fool descends into the basement after finding a piece of Spencer's disguise. Fool soon finds Spencer's body, who has seemingly died of fright, but discovers one of the sought-after gold coins still clutched in his hand. At this point, we are introduced to the titular people under the stairs, who are revealed to be children stolen by the Robesons who didn't follow their incredibly strict rules and were condemned to the basement and made to survive by eating one another. It's later implied that past burglars have also wound up being fed to these cannibals. The people under the stairs surround Fool, and despite his efforts to save Spencer's body, it is dragged away by the cannibals. Before they can turn on Fool himself, he is rescued by Alice. Alice demonstrates her knowledge of the passageways and traps by freeing Fool from the basement. This act of benevolence lets Fool know he has a friend inside this house of horrors. The house of the Robesons is labyrinthine, filled with passageways and tunnels, traps and slides. The house is designed with the intent of hiding the cannibal children from anyone who might discover them, as well as preventing them from ever escaping. However, one of the people under the stairs by the name of Roach, a friend of Alice, has escaped from the basement prison and into the walls, and torments Daddy, whilst eluding capture. Alice and Roach are co-conspirators, both working to defy the Robesons wherever possible. After a length of time, the police come knocking at the door of the Robesons looking for Leroy and Spencer, having found their van outside, which was linked to another crime the previous day. The Robesons are able to turn the police away, demonstrating their ability to conceal the horrors within, as well as the privilege they possess when law enforcement comes poking around. Soon after, Leroy is shot and killed, leaving Fool alone in the house with only Alice and Roach as allies. Unfortunately, after helping Fool, Roach gets shot by Daddy. Also, I guess it's worth mentioning now that when Daddy is pursuing Roach, he likes to wear a full gimp costume and yells maniacally, toting his shotgun. It's really fucking weird. Before Roach dies, he gives Fool a bag filled with the gold coins they set out to find, and his dying wish is for Fool to save Alice. Fool and Alice eventually meet back up, and after a harrowing encounter with Daddy, the two make it to the attic, the tallest tower. Fool recalls that there is a garden pond just out of sight under the attic window, and the two of them can escape if they are willing to take a leap of faith. Alice, who has never been outside the walls of her prison, another similarity to certain fairy tales, is frozen with fear at the thought of the outside world. Fool leaps to freedom as the Robesons advance, but not before promising to return to rescue Alice. Fool makes it back home, where he is met by his grandfather. His grandfather appraises the coins that Fool managed to bring back with him, and is pleased to discover that it's worth enough to pay their back rent, as well as many months to come, and enough to pay for the surgery that Fool's mother needs. A happy ending, right? Well, not yet. Fool has to go back for Alice, having seen the conditions she's been living in and the horrors she's surrounded by. Fool is not a boy, but a man of his word at this point, saying, "I made a promise and I need to keep it." Before he goes, he is given some background by his grandfather on the place that he just narrowly escaped from. Here we discover that Mommy and Daddy are actually not husband and wife, but brother and sister, inadvertently making this the second consecutive video where incest has been a plot point of the film I discuss. I don't know how this happened, but I promise it wasn't intentional. The Robesons came from a family that ran a funeral home, who later got into real estate and started buying up property after property in the neighborhood, one of which is the building that Fool and his family live in. Driven mad by greed and religious delusions, the Robesons somehow stole children from the neighborhood and raised them as their own. But when these children broke the rule of don't speak, see, or hear evil, they were punished and cast down to the basement. Alice is the sole exception, having cleverly been able to avoid triggering the rage of Mommy. Alice isn't actually the daughter of the mad couple, unbeknownst to her. This is the origin of the cannibals, their development stunted and repressed and forced to live a life never being able to see the world beyond. Before heading back to rescue Alice, Fool calls child services on the Robesons and used the distraction to sneak into the property. He finds Alice strung up in the attic, and by ascending the chimney he's able to free her. They can't escape the way he did last time, as the garden pond has been drained and filled with rocks and broken glass. In their attempt to escape, Fool finds himself in the basement with Daddy, while Alice is attacked by Mommy upstairs. While in the basement, Fool decides that he has to try to save the other prisoners if he can. At this point, Fool has told Alice that the Robesons aren't actually her parents, and Alice reminds Mommy of this during their confrontation. Enraged, Mommy decides that Alice must die. Meanwhile, Fool is about to be shot by Daddy when a knock at the front door upstairs stops him in his tracks. It's Ruby, who launches into a verbal assault on Mommy, berating her long enough to allow the people under the stairs to help Fool in the basement. Meanwhile, back upstairs, Ruby has been joined by the rest of the community. Bolstered by their numbers, they accuse the Robesons of all the crimes they've been committing over the years. Mommy is about to shoot Ruby, but is stopped by Alice. Fool is led to a secret room in the basement by one of the people under the stairs that is filled with generations of wealth, in the form of paper money, gold coins, and jewelry. Back upstairs, the outside community is locked out, and Mommy is about to stab Alice when the people under the stairs burst through the basement and chase her through the house. Shortly after, she's stabbed by Alice and thrown to the basement. While this is happening, Daddy bursts into the secret room but discovers Fool with a lit fuse connected to some explosives. If Daddy shoots, all the money will be blown to bits. Enraged, Daddy shoots anyway, causing Fool to detonate the explosives. Fool is blown to safety, and this results in a chain reaction throughout the house, and all of the money hidden within rains down on the community outside. Daddy falls into the watery pit that he dumped so many bodies into over the years, a fitting end to his legacy. Alice and Fool reunite, and after Alice asks how he is, Fool tells her,
"I feel like $1 million.
The people under the stairs, finally free, disappear into the night while the community revels in the demise of their cruel landlords and the redistribution of wealth so long overdue. As I mentioned earlier, this story is a lot like a fairy tale. The opening sequence with the tarot cards perfectly delivers these themes. However, Wes Craven knows that real life is not as cut and dry as a fairy tale. It's more nuanced than that. In a more straightforward horror movie, the cannibals in the walls would be the villains. In The People Under the Stairs, they're the victims. The outwardly normal husband and wife are the ones harboring dark secrets. Like real life, things often aren't as black and white as they seem. Immediately, you are invested in the character of Fool, seeing the struggles he deals with at a young age. You want him to succeed. He goes on this life-changing odyssey that shapes the trajectory of his life and his family's. He rises above the circumstances of his situation. He doesn't succumb to them. Despite the bleakness of his situation, he never loses that part of him that makes him human. He never gives up. On the flip side, you immediately dislike the Robesons for all the things they represent. They embody the worst parts of humanity. Racism, greed, and a lack of empathy for anyone outside of their social bubble. In real life, people such as these rarely get the comeuppance they deserve, but in Craven's world, we're able to live vicariously through him and live out his fantasy. The racial themes of the film are just as relevant today as they were back in 1991, arguably even more so. For being made in the 90s, the film tackles some issues that have only increased in relevancy, making it somewhat ahead of its time. Things like classism, gentrification, and racism. The film is tackling a lot of serious subjects, all the while juxtaposing this with a sort of urban fairy tale plot device. In my opinion, it is handled beautifully, perfectly saying the things that it wants to say. Juggling all these heavy topics and still managing to be a coherent, entertaining film is no small feat. The film taps into real-world issues to make you care about the characters. I believe this is what has allowed People Under the Stairs to age so well, and will continue to for years to come. So have you seen People Under the Stairs? It might not be the first movie you think of when you think of Wes Craven, but I think it's actually held up really well, and you should definitely check it out. Also, who is on your Mount Rushmore of horror directors? I'd be interested to hear, so please leave a comment in the comment section, and consider subscribing for more closer looks at forgotten horror movies. For now, it's time to put Sleepwalkers back on the shelf. What will I decide to watch next? I have no idea. So until then, take care and watch more movies.